This is lecture 134 in the ABCs of Communism series. This set of lectures accompanying the forthcoming volume 8 on communism in North America prior to white contact. And our subject this morning is Prehistoric Florida. The first people arrived in Florida long before the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna. Human remains and artifacts have been found in association with the remains of Pleistocene animals at a number of Florida locations. A carved bone depicting a mammoth found near the site of Vero Man has been dated to 20,000 BP. Artifacts recovered at the Page-Ladson site date to 14,500 BP. Evidence that a giant tortoise was cooked in its shell at Little Salt Spring dates 13,500 BP, and human remains and artifacts have been found in association with the remains of Pleistocene animals at Devil's Den, Melbourne, Warm Mineral Springs, and the Cutler Fossil Site. A bison antiquus skull with an embedded projectile point was found in the Wassissa River. Other important lithic stage sites include Harney Flats in Hillsborough County, the Nowcrest site, and Silver Springs. Florida's environment at the end of the Pleistocene was very different from that of today, because the enormous amount of water frozen in ice sheets during the last glacial period, wherein the sea level was at least 330 feet lower than today, accounts for that. Florida had about twice the land area, and its water table was much lower. So the climate was cooler and drier, and there were a few running rivers or springs in what is today's Florida. The few water sources in the interior of Florida were rain-fed lakes and water holes over relatively impervious deposits of marl or deep sinkholes partially filled by springs. With water available only at scattered locations, animals and humans would have congregated at the water holes to drink. The concentration of animals would have attracted hunters, and many lithic stage artifacts and animal bones show butchering marks. This limestone and dolomite karst topography features deep sinkholes that would have provided access to water. Sites with upper lithic artifacts also have been found in flooded river valleys as much as 17 feet under the Gulf of Mexico. There are probably sites identified as much as 20 miles offshore under less than 38 feet of water. Half of the upper lithic sites in Florida are now underwater in the Gulf of Mexico. Materials deposited in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene in sinkholes in the beds of rivers were covered then by silt and sealed in place before the water table rose high enough to create running rivers. Those layers remained undisturbed until excavated by archaeologists, and these deposits preserved organic materials including bone, ivory, wood, and other plant remains. Archaeologists have found direct evidence that these early people in Florida hunted mammoths, mastodons, bison antiquus, and giant tortoises, the bones of other large and small animals including ground sloths, tapirs, horses, camelids, deer, fish, turtles, shellfish, snakes, raccoons, possums, and muskrats are associated with these lithic sites. Now we'll take a look at the technology, these stone tools first of all. Organic materials are not well preserved in warm, wet climate and often acidic soils of Florida. Organic materials that can be dated through radiocarbon dating are rare at upper lithic sites in Florida, usually found only where the material has remained underwater continuously since the upper lithic period. Stone tools are therefore often the only clues to dating prehistoric sites without ceramics in Florida. Projectile points have distinctive forms assigned to specific periods. Now we can divide the primitive communist period into the pre-Archaic Florida into three periods. Now early upper lithic from 20,000 to 11,000 BP is the first one. The earliest material is from the Page-Ladson site, where pre-Clovis points found at Cactus Hill have been recovered from deposits dated to 14,588 to 14,245 BP, and many recovered in rivers. Secondly, the middle upper lithic from 11,000 to 9,000 BP. Projectile points include Beaver Lake, Clovis, Folsom Lake, Points, Simpson, Suwannee, Tallahassee, and Santa Fe points. Simpson and Suwannee points are the most common. Now thirdly, the late Upper Lithic from 9000 to 8000 BP. In this period, Boland, Greenbrier, Hardaway, Side Notch, Knuckles, Dalton, and Mariana points are diagnostic, with the Boland points being the most commonly found on dry land sites as well as in rivers. People of the Upper Lithic in Florida used a large variety of stone tools besides projectile points. These tools include blades, scrapers of various kinds, spoke shaves, gravers, gouges, and bola stones. Spoke shaves are a kind of moon crescent shaped flake or blade that are used to scrape a long piece of wood so that you can make an arrow out of it. Some of the stones, such as the Hendrick scraper of the early Upper Lithic period and the Edgefield scraper of the late Upper Lithic, are sufficiently diagnostic to date deposits. There are other Upper Lithic tools at a few underwater sites in Florida, made of ivory, bone, antler, shell, and wood. One type of artifact found in rivers in northern Florida is the ivory foreshaft. One end of a foreshaft was attached to a projectile point with pitch and sinew. The other end was pointed and pressure fitted into a wood shaft. The foreshafts were made from mammoth or mastodon ivory. A shell trigger made maybe from an atlatl, that is a spear thrower. Other tools include an eyed needle made from bone, double-pointed bone pins, part of a mortar carved from an oak log, and a non-returning boomerang or throwing stick made from oak. Now the Archaic period itself in Florida lasted from 8000 BP until 2500 BP. Pre-ceramic early Archaic period is the 8000 to 7000 BP, the middle ceramic Archaic from 7000 to 5000 BP, and the late Archaic from 5000 to 2500 BP. Several cultures are identified for Florida in the middle to late Archaic period. In northeast Florida, the pre-ceramic Mount Taylor period, 7000 to 4000 BP, was followed by the ceramic Orange culture, 4300 to 2500 BP. The Norwood culture in the Appalachia region of Florida's 4300 to 2500 BP was contemporary with the very similar Orange culture, and the late Archaic Elliott's Point complex found in the Florida Panhandle from the delta of the Apalachicola River westward may have been related to the Poverty Point culture. The area around Tampa Bay in southwest Florida from Charlotte Harbor to 10,000 Islands each had late Archaic ceramic regional cultures. And this brings us to the formative stage cultures. Sedentary village life with agriculture and mound building appeared along the southwest coast of Florida at Horace Island and in the lower Mississippi River Valley at Watson Break and Poverty Point well before the end of the Archaic period. Early Mississippian people built platform mounds, and their professional specialists crafted elegant ceramic vessels that are found at the Weeden Island site. They migrated into Florida from southwest Georgia, where diagnostic remnants exist at the Colamaki site. Colamaki was an advanced theocratic chiefdom that featured the largest flat-topped pyramidal mound in the southeast U.S. Thus we have evidence of a direct connection to the Temple Mound I period of the lower Mississippi Valley, so you can see that this religion of the advanced theocratic chiefdoms was spreading over a very wide area and into Florida. Ceramics appeared along the coast of the southeastern United States soon thereafter. Agriculture spread and intensified in north central and northeast Florida by AD 700. A South Florida culture region based on a predominant type of plain ceramics was extant as early as 950 BC in Perico Island and up to AD 1700 at Marco Island. It penetrated the middle and lower Florida peninsula at the time of the first contact with the Spanish. Now, north to south, we start with the Swift Creek. The Deptford culture from 500 BC to AD 250 occupied the Gulf Coast from Florida-Alabama border to Charlotte Harbor, southwest Georgia, and southeast Alabama. The early woodland Deptford culture evolved in place to become the Santa Rosa Swift Creek culture Burial mounds have yielded trade items that include copper man pipes, ear ornaments, stone plummets, and stone gorgets. These show this area's incorporation within the Hopewellian interaction sphere by AD 100. The Swift Creek culture is a middle woodland period archaeological culture in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, and Tennessee, dating AD 100 to 800. In Florida, Swift Creek ceremonial practices and burial complexes are called the Yent Green Point Complex. These people interacted with the eastern woodlands Hopewell advanced theocratic chiefdoms. The type site is the Swift Creek Mound site in Bibb County, Georgia, and the Leak Mound site in Georgia. In their ATC stage, Swift Creek people built mounds. Their mixed archaic economy featured hunting, gathering, collecting, fishing, and horticulture. The Swift Creek is marked by diagnostic earthenware pottery with complicated stamped designs involving mostly curvilinear elements. Examples of this decoration are the diamond-shaped checks found at the Swift Creek sites. These are features of the Ohio Hopewell sites of Sape Earthworks, Rockhold, Harness, Turner, and the Man site in southern Indiana, as well as the Crystal River site in Florida. The Santa Rosa Swift Creek culture dates AD 150 to 350 in the western Florida panhandle, and AD 150 to 350 in the eastern Florida panhandle and southern Georgia. It featured elaborate ceremonial mound complexes, advanced theocratic chiefdom social ranking, mound burial, permanent settlements, population growth, and an increasing reliance on cultigens. Santa Rosa is associated with the archaeological site Santa Rosa Island in Santa Rosa County, Florida. Swift Creek is associated with the archaeological site near Swift Creek, Bibb County, Georgia. The Santa Rosa Swift Creek culture extended over the western half of the West Florida Panhandle and immediately adjacent parts of Alabama. Sites have been found primarily around estuaries from St. Andrews Bay to Pensacola Bay. It is defined by a mixture of Swift Creek and Marksville variant of the Santa Rosa pottery types in village middens. There are 4 radiocarbon-dated Santa Rosa Swift Creek sites. The 2 sites in Okeechobee Bay have been dated to the period AD 150 to 450, and 2 sites in the Pensacola Bay date AD 350 to 650. Santa Rosa ceramics appeared in both the Okeechobee Bay and Pensacola Bay areas by 50 BC. Now, in other parts of North Florida, we have the Weed Island 1 dates of AD 100 to 1000 that includes the Florida Panhandle, North Peninsular Gulf Coast, and Southwest Georgia sites of AD 100 to 700. Weed Island cultures are defined by ceramics which fall into 2 categories, sometimes called secular and sacred. Sacred ceramics are found primarily in mounds, while secular ceramics are found primarily in middens and house sites. The 2 types of ceramics have separate histories, and the secular ceramics show considerable variation between regions. The Weed Island was an ATC sacred complex featuring the unifying Hopewell and Mississippian religion. The secular components of Weed Island cultures emerged from the Swift Creek culture during the Middle Woodland period, AD 200 to 500, in the lower Chattahoochee Apalachicola River drainage where Alabama, Florida, and Georgia meet. To the east of this Weed Island heartland, Weed Island secular components developed from the Deptford culture, which, as we have seen, evolved from the Swift Creek culture. The sacred or ceremonial component of Weed Island is a feature of the unifying religion and is a diagnostic of the Yent and Greenpoint traditions. It persisted in some areas until the end of the woodland period, AD 1200. Weed Island sites have been found from Mobile Bay to the Okefenokee Swamp and from south of Tampa Bay to the fall line on the Chattahoochee River at Columbus, Georgia. The initial economy was broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation in the hardwood hammock areas and coastal, riverine, and marine resources. Eventually, the multiple geographic variants confronting Weeden Island groups meant a variety of subsistence strategies, including agriculture. The site on Weeden Island featured sacred ceramics and was part of the Weeden Island-related late Minnesota culture. The Minnesota culture developed around 500 BC, 700 years before the development of the Weeden Island Sacred Complex. The Cades Pond culture of north-central Florida dates AD 200 to 750. The North Florida McKeithen Weeden Island culture dates AD 200 to 700. The Weeden Island, too, dates AD 750 to 1000 in the Florida Panhandle and the North Peninsular Gulf Coast in Florida and southwest Georgia. The Panhandle Wauchula culture dates AD 750 to 1000. The North Central Florida Alachula culture dates AD 700. The North Florida Suwannee Valley culture dates AD 750, and the Mississippian Fort Walton culture dates AD 1000. The Pensacola Mississippian culture of AD 1250 included the Panhandle, southern Alabama, and southern Mississippi. Now to the Gulf Coast. On Florida's central Gulf Coast, the Safety Harbor culture dates AD 800. People of the Minnesota culture lived from 550 BC until AD 900 there. From AD 300 to 700, the Minnesota people adopted the ceremonial ceramics and burial practices of the Weeden Island cultures of northern Florida and adjacent Alabama and Georgia. And we can see that the ATC religion was spreading over large areas where people were ready to accept it. The Weeden Island of Pinellas County and the Tampa-St. Petersburg Clearwater area of Florida's Central Gulf Coast was part of the Weeden Island-related late Minnesota culture, although the Weeden Island site is well outside the heartland of the Weeden Island culture. Nevertheless, the Minnesota culture developed around 500 BC, 700 years before the development of the Weeden Island Sacred Complex. So we can see two phases from simple chiefdoms to advanced theocratic chiefdoms with regard to Weeden Island and the Weeden Island culture. By 5000 BP, people of the Florida Gulf Coast had developed a mixed economy of hunting, gathering, fishing, and shellfish collecting. By 2500 BP, these people were tribal agriculturalists with a distinctive set of diagnostic ceramic traits and stone and bone tool types that archaeologists have defined as the Minnesota culture. The Minnesota archaeological culture occupied the central Gulf Coast of the Florida Peninsula from about 500 BC until AD 900. It evolved into the Safety Harbor culture. By AD 500, the Minnesota people had adopted the ATC religion of the Weeden people in the north. There are 25 archaeological sites around Tampa Bay and between Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor belonging to this Minnesota culture. Now, key among all of this is Key Marco and Horrors Island. Key Marco is an archaeological site on a large shell works island next to Marco Island, Florida. A small pond on Key Marcos, called the Court of the Pile Dwellers, has seen the recovery of more than 1,000 wooden artifacts. The island itself was composed of shell mounds and other shell works and separate from Marco Island. Horrors Island, that's Horr'S, has the oldest indigenous burial mound of the eastern U.S., dating to 3,450 BP. It was the site of the largest permanently occupied Florida archaic community from 10,000 BP to 3,000 BP. The Court of the Pile Dwellers at Key Marco was a small muck pond covering less than an acre. The conditions in the muck preserved the wood and other objects, including those made with bone, fiber, gum, rawhide, gut, stone, shell, and pottery, and carved clubs, wooden tablets and plaques, wood ear spools, realistically carved animal heads, carved and painted masks, and a carved wooden feline human figure were recovered. The artifacts were well preserved due to anaerobic conditions. Many of the wooden objects beside the masks had been painted. The colors were still vivid when the objects were first removed from the muck. A photographer with the expedition recorded all the objects soon thereafter and thus preserve the evidence of their appearance. Motive production artifacts found in the pond include bowls, mortars and pestles, spears, atlatls, cords, ropes, nets, net floats, fish hooks. By ceramic association, the pond dates to Glade's period 2 and 3, and we'll discuss more of that here pretty quick. A 15-foot tall mound, 660 feet northeast of the court of the pile dwellers, was tested with 2 pits that yielded a large number of potsherds in distinct strata. These date to Glade's periods 2 and 3. The density of the potsherds indicates that the Key Marco site had a high population density, and presumably the political complexity of an ATC during both Glade's periods 2 and 3. In 1995, evidence was found of 3 platform mound construction phases that produced large houses built on pilings. The stratigraphy features discrete shell and sand strata, along with evidence of numerous post holes that indicate a large structure built on pilings to raise it above the surface of the mound. Marco Island was occupied by the Muspa people, corresponding to the 10,000 Islands district of the Glade culture as defined in archaeology. Around AD 1300, pottery and artifact stylings in the Muspa area changed to become very similar to those of the Calusa people to the north, indicating a close alliance with or absorption by the Calusa, who were still there at the time of white contact. Now, in South Florida, the Belle Glade culture, or Okeechobee culture, is an archaeological culture that existed from as early as 1050 BC until AD 1700 in the area surrounding Lake Okeechobee and in the Kissimmee River Valley in the U.S. state of Florida. The Glades culture by 550 BC in the southeast Florida Everglades and Florida Keys had people of the Belle Glade culture who subsisted on hunting and gathering. Animals in the diet included deer, turtle, snake, fish, and freshwater mollusks, and maize eventually became the mainstay of the mixed economy. Major archaeological sites of the Belle Glade culture include the Belle Glade Mound, Big Mound City, Boynton Mound Complex, Fort Center, Ortona Mound, and Tony's Mound. The Belle Glade site is 1.5 miles west of the city of Belle Glade, and Big Mound City, 15 miles south of Belle Glade. The cultural area is defined by a combination of mounds, earthworks, and pottery found around Lake Okeechobee and as far north as Lake Kissimmee. The area has poor, sandy soils, many lakes, wetlands, and a low elevation with low relief, with some higher relief along the western and northern edges of the Kissimmee Valley. Vegetation there consists of pine and palmetto flatlands, wet prairies, hammocks or groves of live oak, cabbage palm, and cypress swamps. Pine and palmetto flatwoods characterize eastern Martin and Palm Beach counties and the Kissimmee Valley north of Lake Kissimmee to Lake Tohopekaglia. These were the geographical setting for the Belle Glade culture area determined by the Belle Glade pottery types. People first entered the Lake Okeechobee Basin and Kissimmee River Valley late in the late Lithic stage. They advanced into the Archaic stage, where broad-spectrum hunting and gathering is the diagnostic that defines the Belle Glade. It begins by 1000 BC. The reliable Willie Bullen chronology divided the Belle Glade culture into 3 periods. Transitional, 1000 to 500 BC, Belle Glade 1, 500 to AD BC to AD 1000, and Belle Glade 2, AD 1000 to 1700. A more recent chronology divides the Belle Glade cultures into 4 periods. 1 is 1000 BC to AD 2000, period 2, AD 200 to 700, period 3, AD 700 to 1300, and period 4, AD 1300 to 1700. During the period of European contact, the Miami lived around Lake Okeechobee, and the Jaga people lived in the East Okeechobee area. Either way, we see wild resource exploiting people evolving into tribal agriculture and simple chiefdoms, and some of the latter became advanced theocratic chiefdoms, or ATCs. Pottery found in Belle Glade, at the Belle Glade culture sites, is plain and undecorated. The Belle Glade plain and Glade's plain types. Wood, bone, shell, and shark tooth artifacts have been found at a few Belle Glade sites. Inhabited temple earthworks and burial mounds are diagnostic of the Belle Glade culture. Circular ditches appeared early in the Belle Glade culture by 500 BC. Habitation mounds and burials in mounds also date to the earliest period. The Great Circle was started around 800 BC, and soon after the mortuary mound pond complex was built. These new dates likewise changed the chronology. But in any case, habitation mounds were refuges from flooding during the wet season. Middens are found in oak groves near open water. Now this brings us to the Fort Center site, an archaeological site in Glades County, Florida, northwest of Lake Okeechobee. It was occupied for more than 2,000 years, from 450 BC until AD 1700. The inhabitants of Fort Center were initially cultivating maize centuries before it appeared anywhere else in Florida. Fort Center was a complex of earthwork mounds, linear embankments, middens, circular ditches, and an artificial pond. These occupy an area 1 mile long and a half-mile wide, extending east-west along Fish-Eating Creek, a stream that empties into Lake Okeechobee. The area around Fish-Eating Creek was occupied by people of the Belle Glade culture by 3000 BP. The Fort Center site features 3 environments: a meander belt along the stream consisting of 1, a floodplain swamp and natural levees, 2, a wet prairie, and 3, an oak, cabbage, palm saw, palmetto grove. The floodplain and prairie are subject to frequent flooding. The prairie consists of 2 to 4 feet of sandy soil on hardpan, resulting in poor drainage. The stream meander belt cuts below the hardpan. Now, pollen evidence shows that the river meander belt and prairie existed in essentially their current condition since human occupation there began around 3,000 years ago. The area covered by hammocks or groves has increased since sustained occupation ended at AD 1700. Fort Center is in the Lake Okeechobee Basin, an area that surrounds and drains into Lake Okeechobee, and is synonymous with the Belle Glade culture area in southern Florida. The Kissimmee River Valley is a sub-area of the Lake Okeechobee Basin Belle Glade culture area. Now, mounds, ditches, canals, and other earthworks have been found at a number of locations in interior southern Florida. More than 30 sites of the Belle Glade culture and its predecessors are known from the area around Fish-Eating Creek. A number of sites with extensive earthworks have been found in the Belle Glade culture area, including 7 other sites in southern Florida. Complexes with sequences of construction and architectural style identical to those in Fort Center occur from Lake Tohopekaglia in the north to Palm Beach and Hendry counties to the south. There are also similarities between Fort Center and Crystal River sites. The complex was excavated over 6 years from 1966 to 71 by teams from the University of Florida, Colgate University, and Florida Atlantic University. In 2010, further research at the Fort Center sites confirmed much of the previous work and added Fort Center as one of the many monumental earthworks in the Glades Calusa culture region of South Florida. Recent archaeology shows that immediately after the construction of the Great Circle, work commenced on the building of the mortuary mound and pond complex nearby. In 2017, anthropologist Nathan Lors evaluated the monumental architecture at Fort Center and the entire Kissimmee-Okeechobee area in socioeconomic terms. Nevertheless, we can still rely on the older periodization as follows. Period 1 was characterized by human-created mounds that supported living areas and by circular ditches that enclosed fields. Only one or a few maintenance families lived on the site at any given time. Maize pollen was found in middens on the mounds and in the nearby fields dating from this period. 5 artificial mounds are in or near the stream meander zone. They are each around about 100 feet in diameter and 2 to 3 feet high. Most of these mounds are now part of the natural levees along the Fish-Eating Creek. The mounds were built on existing natural levees, and their presence helped shape the levees. 3 burials were found at Mound 13, which may have been used as a burial mound and later as a house mound. Potsherds were found in the other mounds. The Okeechobee Basin is subject to frequent flooding. Mounds are required in most parts of the basin to raise house floors above flood levels. The only place in the area high enough to remain above the floodwaters was a section of the old natural levees. Part of the levee named Midden B was also used as a living site during Period 1. The mounds at Fort Center were mostly used as house platforms. However, some mounds and earthworks served religious and administrative roles. The site was inhabited because it provided easy access to food sources in the stream. The mortuary mound and pond complex was built much earlier, and a few maintenance families lived permanently on the site, and a larger number of people living there and nearby during times of construction. Construction was periodically constant for 25 centuries. Such labor discipline over millennia is proof of the ATC status at one time, as it would have necessitated labor force living nearby. And in fact, I think that what we have here is 3 phases. We begin with the tribal agricultural or simple chiefdom stage. Then we have an advanced theocratic chiefdom stage, and eventually this would have evolved into a slave-based kingdom. And this should be excellent doctoral dissertation material for future archaeologists, and I would include those of you who are students in Florida or will be to consider that as your topic. Archaeologists identified 3 circular ditches at Fort Center. 2 were about 300 feet in diameter and partially overlapped. A third, later circular ditch, was about 1,200 feet in diameter. It enclosed the earlier ditches, but was not concentric with either of them. This ditch was 25 to 30 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Most of the dirt from the ditch had been thrown on its inner side. There were 2 gaps in the ditch, one on the southeast side and another on the east side, closest to Mount B in the Ceremonial Complex. Maize pollen was found under soil that had been disturbed from digging the ditches. Radiocarbon dating indicates that all 3 circles were complete by 450 BC. The maize pollen indicates that the circles were used for cultivation. The ditches around the circles penetrated the hard pan, helping to drain the prairie soil. The Great Circle was used for gardens from 350 BC until the end of Period 2 at AD 700. The circles at Fort Center were earlier than those of the Adena culture of the Ohio River Valley and are Hopewell ATC relics, and we've discussed that in previous chapters and lectures. In researching the circular ditches at Fort Center, investigators employed LIDAR technology and discovered that there were actually 4 concentric circular ditches. Their measurement of the larger outer circle was 1,197 feet in diameter. The greatest discovery by this team was the discovery that the circular ditches were routinely destroyed and rebuilt. This tells me that the Glade's religion featured a complex mythology involving the creation, destruction, and death concepts. And that takes us to Period 2. During Period 2, from AD 200 until AD 500, the 5 family residents maintained the ceremonial centers. 2 mounds, A and B, and an artificial pond constitute that ceremonial complex. An embankment or wall surrounds Mound B and the pond, both ends attached to Mound A. Part of the area enclosed by the embankment forms what appears to be a courtyard. The complex was located on the prairie, close to the stream meander belt, and was the focus of the Fort Center site during Period 2. Mound A was a living site, irregular in shape, and about 3 feet tall. 2 slightly higher places on the mound were structures. Middens on Mound A contained potsherds, maize pollen, animal bones, which were mostly deer, and human baby teeth. Some human bones, broken similarly to the animal bones, were found at the middens. Shell tools, stone grinding tools, and pipes were found in the living areas of the mound, as were potsherds of imported ceramics, including types identified as Deptford, Cartersville, Pasco, Crystal River, and St. John's. Many post holes found in the lower level of the mound indicate that round or oval houses about 30 feet in diameter had stood on the mound. There were also pits in which shells had been burned to produce lime. Unburned shells around the edges of the lime pits were mainly river mussels, but also included conchs and Venus clams. Human coprolites, that is feces preserved by exposure to the lime, were found around the edges of the pits. Mound A was expanded at least twice during period 2 and 3, AD 200 to 1200, with a particularly dense midden area deposited in the first half of that period. Some habitation of the mound extended past AD 1400. Now, at its final development, Mound B was cone-shaped, with a steeper slope on the upper part and with a slightly truncated top. Decayed conch shells, along with badly decayed human bones and teeth, were found on the original surface of the mound below the lowest midden layer of Mound B. Dirt excavated from the adjacent pond was used to build the earliest part of Mound B and the embankment that surrounded the mound connecting to Mound A at both ends. Around AD 500, Mound B was built up, more with dirt from another borrow pit rather than the pond. Around AD 500, Mound was built up with that dirt. Now, around 150 secondary bundled burials were placed in the sides of the mound in the dirt added at this time. No artifacts were found with the secondary burials, but small deposits of muck, presumed to be from the pond, associated with mounds A and B, were found with them. A set of objects, described by Sears as a Hopewellian-type deposit, was found in the side of Mound B, facing the pond. Mound B was originally used as a living site and for preparing and bundling bodies. The habitation area was later moved to Mound A, while the body preparation activities continued on Mound B. Use of Mound A for ceremonial purposes is indicated by broken pipes found on Mound A and in the charnel pond. Pipes have been found at only one other place, the University of Florida mound at Fort Center. Habitation of Mound A apparently continued for a while after the site ceased being used as a ceremonial center. The artificial pond in the ceremonial complex was 4 to 5 feet deep, with a nearly flat bottom. It was cut through the hard pan, allowing water above the hard pan to flow into the pond, keeping it full. Dirt from Mound B had washed into the pond, partially filling it. Excavation of the pond yielded wooden objects, human bones from about 150 individuals, and human coprolites. Some of the wooden pieces found in the pond were carved. Some of the carvings had remnants of a lime-based coating. Other pieces of wood were long enough to have been set in the bottom of the pond and hold the carvings above the water. Some of the wood was rotted, other pieces were charred. Under the wood and bones was a midden layer consisting of sherds, shells, pipe fragments, and human coprolites. A large number of carved beast and bird effigies are in the same naturalistic style of Calusa wood carving. Sears interpreted the pond as a charnel pond with a wooden platform in the pond holding bundled bodies. The carved figures of birds and animals found in the pond were mounted on the platform. The platform stood long enough for some of the wood to rot. The platform apparently caught fire and collapsed into the pond sometime around AD 500. The bones found in the pond accounted for about 150 bodies, and about 150 bundled bodies with muck from the pond were found buried in Mound B. About half of the bundled bodies dumped into the pond were recovered and reburied in Mound B. Artificial ponds occur at 2 other sites near Fish-Eating Creek. Analysis of the bones found in the charnel pond and in Mound B indicate the people suffered from osteoarthritis and anemia due to parasite infections and iron deficiency. However, they were relatively well nourished and showed less tooth wear than other contemporary populations in Florida. However, few lived past age 35, and none in the analyzed population lived past age 55. Sears interpreted the complex consisting of mounds A and B and the charnel pond as a ceremonial center where mortuary specialists processed bodies, cleaning flesh from bones. They probably lived with their families on Mound B early in Period 2, moving to Mound A later in the period. They served a population that spread through a large area and probably also supplied tobacco, pipes, and lime for processing maize to the surrounding population. The 300 bodies kept on the platform may represent the people of the ceremonial center over several centuries. All of the residents of the ATC Ceremonial Center were of high rank. The center served the Okeechobee Basin, including the Kissimmee Valley. There were many small sites with single houses on mounds throughout the area. In Period 3, which runs from AD 700 to AD 1300, the ceremonial center was no longer active. Two places on the natural levees along the Fish-Eating Creek, Midden A, dates to the early part of the period, and Midden B to the latter part. There is continuity in the artifacts from Period 2 into Period 3. Period 4 ran from AD 1300 to AD 1700. Most of this period was after European contact began affecting the peoples of Florida. Artifacts recovered from this period include reworked metal of Spanish origin. Occupation continued at Middens A and B on the natural levee along Fish-Eating Creek and expanded to new mounds on the prairie away from the stream meander zone. Linear earthworks associated with those mounds also appeared in this period. Maize pollen was found in deposits from this period. Burials from after AD 1500 were found in the top of Mound B. Most of these burials were flexed while the rest were bundled. Post holes associated with the upper level burials may be from small shelters built over the burials. Burials from Period 4 were associated with grave goods, including objects reworked from Spanish gold, silver, copper, and brass, unlike those from earlier periods. Some of the grave goods may have been symbols or badges of rank. Fort Center was probably part of the Calusa ATC/Kingdom, living in small towns and scattered settlements. During Period 4, several living sites were occupied, including Middens A and B, and Mounds 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8, and the University of Florida Mound. Most of the mounds were new to this period. Mound 3 was built from a small natural mound previously occupied. Broken smoking pipes were found at the original ground level under the University of Florida Mound, indicating the site served a ceremonial purpose before the mound was built. The mounds, not including the middens on the levees, are each big enough for a single house, and each mound is associated with a linear earthwork, which Sears interpreted as agricultural plots. The linear earthworks varied in size from 30 to 100 feet wide and 300 to 1,200 feet long. The earthworks were raised 2 to 3 feet above the prairie and were surrounded by ditches from which the fill was taken. Although one end of each linear earthwork was close to a house mound, they were never connected to the mounds. No artifacts were found in the linear earthworks. Earthworks similar to the mounds and linear ridges at Fort Center have been reported from Belle, Glade, Tony's Mound, Big Mound City, and the Boynton Mound Complex, and these sites were part of the farming culture. The farmers grew maize as a mainstay and otherwise relied on gathering, hunting, and fishing for food. They ate 9 species of turtles, fish, alligators, snakes, frogs, sirens, possums, raccoons, muskrats, moles, squirrels, foxes, bobcats, deer, geese, turkeys, and turkey buzzards. The lime produced by burning shells on Mound A during Period 2 was used to process dried maize into masa corn flour. Pestles found in middens were used to produce mush. The Miami people ate bread from masa and roots. Now, maize was first cultivated at Fort Center by 450 BC. The circular ditches drained fields so that maize could be cultivated in otherwise low fertility soils. These featured high acidity and high levels of aluminum, not suited for growing maize until leached and drained. And that brings us to Turner River. The Turner River site is a large shell work site half a mile from the mouth of the Turner River near Chokoloskee Island. The site covers 30 acres and is a quarter-mile long. It has at least 30 closely spaced mounds. The site was the first in the 10,000 Islands area to be excavated by professional archaeologists. Sears noted structural features similar to those found at Key Marco and Chokoloskee Island and concluded that the region was an important prehistoric population center. He found muck with mineral materials between the mounds and on the lower slopes of the mounds. The bulk of the mounds were clean shell deposits made of small oyster shells placed on submerged mudflats. Based on dating of potsherds found at the site, Sears concluded that the residents of the site had lived on the edge of the river, moving the village toward the water as the mounds built up behind them. All of the potsherds collected at the site were assigned to the Glades 1 and 2 periods, placing occupation of the site from 200 BC to AD 900. And finally, the Atlantic coast of Florida, a few comments on the Deptford culture, which spread to the Atlantic coast from 500 BC and lasted until AD 700, from the mouth of St. Johns River, Florida, to Cape Fear, North Carolina. The St. Johns culture by 550 BC occupied the Atlantic east and central coast of Florida. The Caloosahatchee culture by 500 BC occupied the Charlotte Harbor area to 10,000 islands. These dates from 500 BC to AD 700 along the Atlantic coast from the mouth of the St. Johns River in Florida to Cape Fear in North Carolina. And that brings us to a conclusion of our discussion on prehistoric Florida as a special case. And in the next lecture, I'm going to move on to my old stomping grounds in northern North America and Canada, and we'll look at the cultures of the people there. And that takes care of it for today.